Good morning and welcome to this week's lecture, which is on Beatlemania and the swinging 60s, and which takes 1966 as its focal point. Why speak about the 1960s through the prism of the Beatles and the phenomenon of Beatlemania? Well, because it's very much the case that the 1960s as a decade coincided rather perfectly with the career trajectory of the Beatles as a group. It was in March of 1960 that the forerunner of that group, the Quarrymen, a group formed by John Lennon, changed their name to the Beatles with an ALS at the end, adding a new bassist, Stuart Sutcliffe, to the original members, John Lennon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison. And in October of 1960, when the group was recruited to play a season at the Indra Club in Hamburg in Germany, the drummer Pete Best would join the group, and they would change their name again to the Beatles with a slight change to the spelling of their name, Beatles with an L-E-S. The group, as we remember it today, of course, was not formed until August of 1962, when the drummer Richard Starkey, better known as Ringo Starr, joined the group, replacing Pete Best. What do we mean by Beatlemania? Well, Beatlemania describes that phenomenon of spontaneous and hysterical idolatry, to quote Wintle, which marked the rise to fame of the Liverpool beat group, the Beatles. Beatlemania, of course, is a neologism to express the collective hysteria of the fans towards the group. It comes from Litzermania, which is the term that the German poet Heinrich Heine first coined back in 1844 to describe the hysteria which greeted the performances of the Hungarian pianist and composer Franz Liszt. Beatlemania as a phenomenon began in early 1963. So if the group traces its origins back to 1960, they did not really become successful, or at least provoke this or arouse this idolatry and enthusiasm until early 1963 with the release of their second single, Please Please Me, which went to number 1 in the UK charts on the 2nd of March 1963. That was followed by the single She Loves You, also a number 1 on the 12th of September 1963. But the Beatles had already encountered considerable enthusiasm and a strong fan base in Liverpool, particularly from December of 1960, and the 27th of December 1960, with their first enthusiastically received performance at the Litherland Ballroom in Liverpool. So essentially, Beatlemania is a phenomenon that we can trace from early 1963 through to the last public concert of the Beatles in San Francisco in 1966. But of course the Beatles continued to record and to release records until their final decision to dissolve the partnership at the end of 1970. Let's just return then to, in this prologue, to the origins of the hysteria, the hysterical reception of the Beatles crossed the Atlantic when they first travelled to the United States and were greeted by screaming fans at Kennedy Airport, New York, on the 7th of February 1964. And this began what was later referred to as the British invasion of pop groups that would overtake the American charts. Contributed to the transition from the Beatlemania in the UK crossing the Atlantic to becoming an American and later a global phenomenon was a televised broadcast called The Ed Sullivan Show, on which the Beatles performed live twice, on the 9th of February 1964 and on the 16th of February of that year, reaching an audience estimated at some 73 million viewers. Such was their global success that the Beatles received the award of the MBE, that's to say, member of the British Empire, at Buckingham Palace from the hands of the Queen on the 12th of May 1965. And this signalled the recognition of the phenomenon and of the group's showcasing of British musical culture by the establishment. This establishment recognition was accompanied by commercial developments, and notably the development of Beatle merchandising, the sale of Beatle wigs and clothes, and mock instruments, plastic instruments, that meant that children could imitate their preferred group. The Beatles also initiated the stadium, what later became known as the Stadium Rock phenomenon. On the 15th of August 1965, they played a concert at the Share Stadium in the United States to an estimated crowd of some 55,600 people. But the screaming fans drowned out the music. So the amplification of stadiums in those days was not up to the requirements. And when the Beatles embarked on their final world tour, the public reaction to their concerts would leave them in an increasingly precarious situation. On their last world tour, for instance, in the Philippines, the Beatles were greeted by riots after what was perceived to be a snub towards the wife of the Philippine leader, Imelda Marcos. That was on the 5th of July 1966. They played their last UK concert on the 1st of May 1966, and then continued on a world tour that ended in the United States, where John Lennon would make a public apology for his remarks, his controversial remarks that the Beatles were now bigger than Jesus, remarks that had been greeted by the evangelical Christian right in in record burning ceremonies that amounted to an auto da fe. The Beatles gave their final public concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on the 29th of August 1966 to a crowd of some 25,000. But by this point, the band was seen but not heard. They could not hear themselves play. Such was the level of noise in the stadium that their music and words were drowned out. They were therefore disillusioned with public performance. They were therefore abandoned it, retreat into the studio, where they would continue their recording career with notable highlights being Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Abbey Road. But their final globalized performance came on television on the 25th of June 1967 when they played the song All You Need Is Love on BBC's Our World programme on the first global broadcast, reaching an audience of some 400 million. Abbey Road was released in September of 1969. It was followed by their final record, but not the last one to be recorded. Abbey Road was the last recording. The final record to be released was Let It Be in May of 1970 because it was remastered. And on the 31st of December 1970, Paul McCartney instituted proceedings to dissolve the group. So as we see, the Beatles' career effectively, conveniently for historians, spanned the decade from 1960 to 1970. They would never reform. Indeed, on John Lennon's death, John Lennon was assassinated and killed, shot dead in New York in December of 1980. That all projects to reform the group would of course end there. As for the Beatles' legacy, they are still today the highest selling music act of all time. As recording artists, they have sold at least 600 million records worldwide. They hold the record in the United Kingdom for the most #1 albums and for the most singles sold. And they hold the record in the United States for the most #1 hits. In terms of cultural impact, Time magazine, beginning of the 21st century, featured them among some of the most important people of the 20th century, and their recognition has also attracted considerable work of scholarship within academia, culminating recently in the Cambridge Companion to the Beatles, edited by Cambridge University Press in 2009. By way of conclusion to my introductory remarks, I would like to point out how this perfect correspondence of the Beatles' trajectory with the decade of the 1960s highlights and allows us to explore the idea of the 1960s as a progressive decade. That reputation of the 1960s as a progressive decade is partly based on the political changes that took place in the course of the decade, but also, as we shall see, partly also in terms of the social reforms. It was effectively a decade of social reform in the United Kingdom as in the United States. The decade began in February of 1960 with the speech by Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, which launched the decolonisation, or at least the second wave of decolonisation of the British Empire, decolonisation in Africa. That speech is better known as the Wind of Change speech, and it was made to the South African Parliament in, therefore, February of 1960. The second wave of decolonisation saw in the course of the 1960s the British colonies of the Mediterranean, Cyprus and Malta, becoming independent. Cyprus in August of 1960, Malta in September of 1964, alongside other countries of what was then the British Empire and Commonwealth. During this period, Britain contemplated entering the European Economic Community, and negotiations for entry officially began in November of 1961. They would, however, be refused in January of 1963, so it's the first veto of that application, a veto famously inspired by France, and they would again, further negotiations at the end of the decade would founder once again on the French veto in December of 1967. Within the United Kingdom, the political changes of the period were notable in that the decade saw the Conservatives' monopoly on political power broken, monopoly on power, that is, since 1951. So this long period of the Conservatives continuously in government from 1951 to 1963 was eventually ended when Harold Wilson won the 1964 election for Labour, beating the government of Sir Alec Douglas Home, the Conservative Prime Minister who had replaced Macmillan in October of 1963, so for a short-lived Conservative government that only survived until April of 1964. So it was a period of transition. It was the ending of the long period of Tory domination under latterly Macmillan and only briefly Sir Alec Douglas Home. And the Labour government that was elected under Harold Wilson as Prime Minister initially in 1964 had only a narrow majority of some 5 seats, but it would consolidate that majority considerably, extended to 97 seats in March of 1966 in the following general election. Wilson and Labour would remain in power until the election of June 1970, which saw their defeat by the Conservatives, led by Edward Heath. Edward Heath, same passing, the Conservative Prime Minister who would take Britain into Europe, into the EEC, on the 1st of January 1973. So Beatlemania began under a Conservative government, that of Sir Alec Douglas Home, But largely the Beatles' career in Britain unfolded against the background of successive Labour governments of a reforming nature. For instance, in October of 1965, Labour moved to abolish the death penalty, and Parliament passed a bill to do so in that year. In May of 1969, the Labour government reduced the voting age to 18. And in January of 1970, it reduced the age of majority to 18. So that in recognition of the growing youth culture in the United Kingdom. So if we're interested in, as we are in this case with British society and reading British society through the prism of the Beatles' career and Beatlemania as a social phenomenon, we need to bear in mind the social conditions of the period. So the British population at the time was 55.6 million in 1961 at the start of the decade. But the growth rate of that population had been falling and would continue to fall. So from 0.48% in 1951 to 0.26% in 1971. I'm describing the average percentage increase in population growth. In other words, the baby boom generation was coming to an end. And those born at the beginning of the 1960s or by the mid-1960s are often described as the tail enders of the baby boom. The period was remarked by many and various social reforms. One important reform was decided under the Conservative administration of Sir Alec Douglas Home in 1963 on the recommendations of the Robbins Committee, and that was to double the number of university places made available over the next 10 years. So to double them from roughly 100,000 to 218,000. And higher education was expanded even further to create a further 172,000 places. So there's a considerable expansion in university and higher education, which will no longer be the preserve of the upper classes and the upper middle classes. More young people are staying in this period, staying longer in education. For instance, the number of 11 to 14-year-olds at school, still at school, between 1951 and 1968 increased from 93% to 100%. The number of 15 to 18-year-olds staying on at school increased in the same period, 1951 to 1968, from 12.5% to 30%. The 60s were also a period of considerable progress for women's rights. I'll mention just three key reforms in that domain. The Abortion Act was passed in 1967 to allow for the legal termination of pregnancy and for family planning. The Divorce Act was passed in 1969 to liberalize the divorce laws and grant divorce on any grounds showing an irretrievable breakdown in a marriage. And finally, the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1970 to prevent discrimination in pay between men and women doing the same work. And that came into operation in December of 1975. In parallel, progressive measures. In 1967, Parliament passed a homosexual law reform act which decriminalised adult homosexual relations in the United Kingdom. So that in 1967. So this period of considerable social reform, largely brought about by a Labour government, coincided with the extraordinary popularity of the British beat group, known as, from Liverpool, known as the Beatles. Now we're going to approach our subject through a general question and through three different themes. The question is, was Beatlemania a phony, ephemeral phenomenon, or was it, as that critic Ian MacDonald supposed, a revolution in the head? Revolution in the Head is the title of the music critic Ian MacDonald's book about the Beatles records in the 60s, which is considered by many to be the finest piece of Beatles scholarship, and was originally published in 1994. Now we're going to approach this problematics from three directions. The first is the direction of considering Beatlemania as a social phenomenon. In the second, we will look at the politics of Beatlemania. And finally, we shall look at the idea of the soundtrack to our lives, the soundtrack to the 60s, to what extent the Beatles' experimentations in the domain of popular music redefined the possibilities of that art form. In terms of key dates, we're going to be considering essentially the period 1963 to 66, which, as I explained, is the period of Beatlemania, of this hysterical popular reception of the Beatles' music, notably in performance. But there are a number of secondary dates that are associated with this. 1995 saw the release by the surviving Beatles, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr, and the widow of the assassinated Beatle John Lennon, Yoko Ono, release a retrospective series of records of outtakes and studio demos in 3 volumes entitled Anthology. And that marked, I think, the beginning of the curation by the surviving Beatles and their families of the Beatles' memory and its legacy, its cultural legacy. In 2016 was celebrated the 50th anniversary, therefore, of Revolver 1966, which many critics consider to be the Beatles' most artistically complete album. Our perspectives are therefore going to be the perspectives of cultural history and of social history. Let's begin with the phenomenon of Beatlemania, and I'm taking here as you can see on slide 4, a quotation from the Dictionary of Modern Culture. So this is a dictionary first edited in the 1980s, 1984, and which features the Beatles as one of its entries. This tells us, of course, that the Beatles have acquired by the early 1980s, the status of cultural icons. So the definition of Beatlemania is as follows. The first phase, that of spontaneous and hysterical idolatry, was known as Beatlemania. It began in 1963 with the release of their second single, Please Please Me. It gathered momentum throughout that year with the release of further singles from Me to You, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, all #1 singles, by which time the Beatles had passed from relative obscurity through commercial success to the point at which they were generating the most extravagant fanaticism ever accorded popular entertainers. Well, ever accorded we should qualify by saying that had been accorded to Franz Liszt in the mid-19th century, hence the expression Beatlemania. So that's the phenomenon itself. In 2013, The Guardian published a number of first-hand accounts of what it was like to experience Beatlemania, which seems to many of us today rather remote, although we can explore some of the newsreels on YouTube, Pathé News notably, that will give us illustrations of Beatlemania, particularly in 1965 when the Beatles went to Buckingham Palace to receive the award of the MBE from the Queen. So we have two first-hand witness accounts. The girls were beginning to overwhelm us, remembers Lothian, now 73, and a business consultant. I saw one of them almost getting to Ringo's drum kit, and then I saw 40 drunk bouncers tearing down the aisles. It was like the relief of Mafeking, which is a battle in colonial Africa in the 19th century. It was absolute pandemonium, girls fainting, screaming, wet seats. The whole hall went into some kind of state, almost like collective hypnotism. I'd never seen anything like it. So that's a Radio Scotland reporter who turned to Lothian, the first-hand witness, and gasped, "For God's sake, Andy, what's happening?" Thinking on his feet, the promoter replied, "Don't worry, it's only Beatlemania." So The Guardian claiming in 2003 to have found the source of the expression Beatlemania, and attributed, therefore, to a Radio Scotland journalist when he experienced with one of his friends a Beatles concert up close, firsthand. Throughout 1963, there have been reports of such phenomena. Police escorts were already required to accompany the Beatles to their concerts, and the term very quickly caught on and became a popular coinage. So in this Guardian retrospective, which you can still consult online, which is available, you will see interviews with both British and American fans bearing witness to the phenomenon when they were concert goers in the early 1960s. That which just underline the fact that Beatlemania was not confined to Liverpool or to Scotland or to the United Kingdom, that it became a transatlantic phenomenon and then a global phenomenon by 1964. The way that the Beatles became cultural icons, I think, is reflected in this cartoon by the New Statesman's resident cartoonist. It's called Vicky. His pen name, Victor Weiss, is his real name. Victor Weiss was a refugee from Hitler's Germany, came to Britain in 1935. He was a political cartoonist, and he drew this representation of the Beatles, reducing them to their simplest expression. So the mop tops, which of course inspired the merchandising, of Beatle wigs and the open mouths of the singers. So Beatlemania reduced to its simplest expression. In the background of this kind of representation, you had serious debates going on in Parliament. So here's in my notes to slide 6, you will see a debate from the House of Lords in 1964, in which one of the speakers, Lord Willis, a Labour member of the Lords, expresses his fears that British culture is being overwhelmed. So Britain's highbrow culture, its cultural canon, its established culture, is being overwhelmed by the new youth culture. And he, in an extract from Hansard, so the Lords, the minutes of the Lords' debates from 13th of May 1964, he says this, I'm referring to my notes, slide 6. Many commercial interests have exploited and whipped up this movement and created more publicity for it. I read a newspaper report about some of the side products of the Beatles industry. There were wigs, sweaters, headbands, shoes, bracelets, belts, boots, tie pins, dolls with cornflakes, and millions of pictures. One firm making plastic busts of Shakespeare for the 400th anniversary discovered they were not making enough money and turned to making plastic busts of the Beatles. So it's an interesting quote from that debate in 1964, and if we fast forward to 2020, you will find cultural historians and social commentators often referring to the Beatles' cultural legacy in the same breath as they refer to Shakespeare. So it's a rather prescient complaint that was made to the Lords in 1964. If we remain with Hansard and the Lords' debate and the Commons' debates of the period, you will find opinion divided. The Parliament is both against Beatlemania and for Beatlemania. Ted Willis, who is quoted in slides 6 and 7, was originally a playwright, a novelist and a screenwriter, who was a Labour peer. He had formerly chaired the Labour Youth League, and he was well known for having scripted a long-running police drama on TV, a TV series called Dixon of Dock Green. He'd been made a life peer by the Conservative government there in December 1963, his declaration against Beatlemania, so his objections to it, as I'm quoting from the slide number 7, this tidal wave of noise and frenetic energy. The idea that it's filling a vacuum in a generation that should have been filled by more traditional cultural forms. And his complaint that Beatlemania is exploitative and commercial, addressed to a teenage market worth £30 million a year, as he puts it. So striving to make a quick buck out of that market. All of these objections were not made purely along party lines. There were more perhaps conservative objections than Labour objectors, but the case of Ted Willis shows us that traditionalists amongst Labourites also were concerned by the challenges that the phenomenon posed to British society. On the other hand, conservatives like Norman Miss Campbell, MP, you see quoted in slide 7, was so concerned that his colleagues rejection of Beatlemania would affect their electoral prospects in the run-up to the October 1964 election, that he issued a defense of the Beat phenomenon and a defense of its impact on the nation's youth. I'm returning to the quotation, so slide 8. I was interested in my honourable friend's mention of the Beatles. It is unfair to say that Lennon of the Beatles was not well educated. I cannot say which, but 3 or 4 went to grammar school, and as a group are highly intelligent, highly articulate, and highly engaging. I think that we would draw the wrong conclusions if we thought that the success which they are having came from anything other than great skill. They provide an outlet for many people who find it difficult to integrate themselves into society when they move into adolescence. The Beatles and groups like them are giving such people an outlet and are taking up the slack which ought to have been provided by a deeper education. Okay, so the Beatles having a positive impact on young people as role models, but also by giving them a cultural content that they might not have been able to acquire through education before the education reforms that I mentioned in my prefatory remarks earlier in the lecture. So, Miss Campbell concludes, I'm referring to slide 9, Liverpool was my hometown. The arrival of the various groups has had a remarkable effect. As those who practiced in the courts in Liverpool in the early part of the 1950s know, deep-seated crime, which was becoming all too prevalent, has to a large extent disappeared. In other words, we have a criminological argument in favour of Beatlemania. It brings down the crime rate. So that's the other side of the coin of the parliamentary debate. This brings us to the question of the politics of Beatlemania. And I should point out that the politics of Beatlemania has attracted considerable recent scholarship. I'm referring to an article by Marcus Collins, published in the British Journal of Politics and International Relations in 2014, entitled, that explores the Beatles' politics and argues that the Beatles were instrumental in bringing together the realms of politics and pop. They managed to legitimize pop music, according to Collins, as a means of political expression, and to devise the organizational structures to support such political activity and to politicize those who produced and consumed pop. So it's a recent, relatively recent scholarly article that invites us to take seriously the politics of Beatlemania, indeed the politics of the Beatles themselves. Now, I pointed out in my opening remarks that the Beatles' career spanned the decade, 1960-1970, and to an extent it captured the zeitgeist of what many call the swinging 60s, others the progressive or the promiscuous 60s. Harold Wilson, as Labour Prime Minister, was quick to see the potential that the Beatles offered, the potential to promote his rhetorical vision of a new Britain, that is to say, a reformist Britain, a socially progressive and technologically advanced, modernizing country. New Britain was a fusion, therefore, of Labour's post-war welfare democracy, the so-called New Jerusalem, with this idea of modernity, the modernity of what Wilson called the white heat of the technological revolution. It was Wilson who awarded the Beatles the MBE, so the equivalent of the French Légion d'honneur, in September of 1965 for their services to British exports. It wasn't, of course, the Queen. The Queen gave the award, but it was the government of the day which decided that the award should be made. So their services as much to British exports as to music. It should be noted that several conservative recipients of the MBE returned theirs to the palace in protest against the award to the Beatles. The hypothesis that we are working on is that we can read the Beatles' trajectory to some extent as a barometer of change in British society through the 1960s. Now, the next slide, 11, is a short documentary clip from Pathé News. That's one of the key newsreel producers of the 1960s, of the Beatles' visit to Buckingham Palace to receive their MBEs from the Queen on the 12th of June 1965. And if you take the time to play the clip, you will see that the hysterical reaction of the crowd tells us that Beatlemania is still in full swing in the summer of 1965. The Beatles were much solicited by the political world, and this is illustrated in a cartoon that you will find on slide 7, a cartoon which portrays, by Cummings, the resident cartoonist for the Daily Express newspaper, published on the 11th of September 1963, so this is when the Conservative government is in power under a new Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas Home, who you see bottom right in the picture, crawling between the legs of a policeman. He had succeeded Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, and the cartoon refers to Alec Douglas Home's attempts to sign the Beatles up to the Conservative Party using Macmillan's electioneering slogan, "You've never had it so good," if you'd like to look closely at the caption to the cartoon. "Gentlemen, can't we persuade you to become Conservative candidates? After all, you've never had it so good." The Beatles, at this point in time, of course, were becoming very successful, and many thought very prosperous because of their success, although they were slow to benefit financially from their record sales. So this cartoon tells us that Harold Wilson was not the only politician to see the potential that the Beatles represented in symbolizing an upwardly mobile youth culture. Upwardly mobile in social terms, in terms of class. Here, the Beatles, we should point out, by and large came from a working class background and also from a northern background, and as such represented the underdogs of society. So Alec Douglas Home is represented here because he wanted to capture some of the enthusiasm that the Beatles inspired amongst their British audiences and their youth audiences. He issued a beat record during the Conservative 1964 election campaign, although of course Alec Douglas Home himself was very much an aristocratic, patrician, British conservative in in the mould of traditionalists, and who owned a Scottish country estate. Home would fail in his attempts to persuade the electorate of his modernity, and would lose the 1964 election to Wilson's Labour. So Harold Wilson himself assiduously courted the Beatles at the height of Beatlemania, as you can see from slide 13. Here he is pictured with the 4 members of the band at the Variety Club of Great Britain Show Business Awards in March of 1964. So the political establishment was both challenged by and drawn to the Beatles and Beatlemania. Wilson recognized the political potential of the Beatles' youth, their dynamism, their creativity, their working class origins, their northern accents and identity, and their material success. All of these things could help embody his vision of a progressive New Britain, combining social mobility and social justice with technological innovation. The political affair that Harold Wilson began with Beatlemania would, however, wear thin as the decade progressed. Lennon would later return his own MBE to the palace in protest against the wars in Biafra, that's in West Africa, and in Vietnam in November of 1968, at the height of the counterculture. And George Harrison would pen a famous song which opened the album Revolver, called Taxman, in which he would reference both Mr. Wilson and his rival Mr. Heath in a scathing protest at the high tax rate, 19 shillings in the pound, which the Beatles would find themselves obliged to pay from the earnings of their record sales. In other words, Taxman takes no prisoners. It makes no concessions either to Labour or to the Conservatives. The two political parties are lumped together and rejected as out of touch. Turning to slide 14, we have here a cartoon by Stanley Franklin, the resident cartoonist of the Daily Mirror, from the 30th of April 1965, which alludes to the Beatles' impact on the culture at large. If pop music has become, in the 1960s, had become by the 1960s, one of the popular pastimes of Britons, football was one of the other. And here we see the Beatles featured in the 1965, or imagined taking spectators in the 1965 FA Cup, Football Association Cup final. And of course this cartoon anticipates, to some extent, the political recuperation that the Wilson government would make of football and the success of the England team in winning the World Cup final of 1966. The caption to this cartoon: they changed their minds, the Beatles changed their minds and settled for ordinary tickets, of course, is a tongue-in-cheek allusion to their social mobility. Here they're standing, of course, on stilts high above the crowd. Will they come back to earth? So the Labour oriented Daily Mirror is tongue-in-cheek, considering their status as a political band. I mentioned in my opening remarks that John Lennon famously declared in an interview that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, and this provoked the ire of Christian fundamentalists in the United States, who, on their last world tour, burned Beatles records in the streets and memorabilia. And this cartoon on slide 15 alludes ironically to the Beatles' opposition to racial segregation and discrimination in the US during the Civil Rights Movement. They're known to have refused to perform in front of racially segregated audiences. The political tensions over their touring and their own political engagement, in this case in favor of civil rights in the United States, were contributing factors to their decision to end touring in 1966 and to concentrate on a recording career. Another contributing factor was the riots that accompanied their last performances and their last world tour in the Philippines and in San Francisco's Candlestick Park. So that's in the summer of 1966. There's an allusion in the cartoon on slide 16 that appeared in the Daily Mail in July of 1966, an allusion to Manila, so the Philippines. And we see Harold Wilson greeting the Beatles on the doorstep of number 10. Harold Wilson was known notoriously for giving doorstep interviews during his tenure as Prime Minister. And there is an allusion in this cartoon to the war in Vietnam and John Lennon's principled opposition to that war in returning his MBE in 1960, that he would do later in 1968. So, consideration of the Beatles, political perceptions of the Beatles and the Beatles' impact on British politics leads us to consider another aspect of the Beatles and the popular expression, the soundtrack of our lives, helps us broach this aspect of the problematics. The idea that popular music can provide mood music, as it were, for our memories and our nostalgia can be traced directly back to the era of Beatlemania. And so in this final, third section of the lecture, I shall explore the political, social and creative ramifications of the Beatles' first made-in-the-studio masterpiece, Revolver. I should point out that for a long time critics considered that the Beatles' finest album, their finest creative product, was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But recently, the weight of critical opinion has moved towards considering Revolver, the earlier record, as a truly revolutionary breakthrough in terms of popular music as an art form. And this, to some extent, is illustrated by the cover art for the album. This has become one of the iconic covers and one of the most famous covers ever designed for a record, so in this case a long player, an LP record, a vinyl record as we know them today. And this cover art was drawn by the German artist and musician Klaus Voormann, who was a close friend of the Beatles, who had befriended them in Hamburg in the earliest days of their career, at the start of their career, back in 1960, when they first began to perform in the northern German port city. Bormann was then an art student at Art College in Hamburg, and he would go on to continue to work with the Beatles and as a close friend through the 1960s and indeed into their post-Beatles careers in the 1970s. When the Beatles ceased touring in 1966, following the riots in the Philippines and in the United States, and the Christian fundamentalist protests against Lennon's alleged blasphemy, they retreated into the studio and began to experiment with sound effects and production techniques and technologies. And this marked a mid-career shift in emphasis. The first product of this was the album Revolver, and today, as I said, largely critically adjudged to be their finest, alongside perhaps Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was the next album they released in 1967. Revolver is kicked off by an overtly political track, George Harrison's Taxman, which denounces the high rates of taxation that imposed by the Labour government of the day, but which, as I said earlier, which treats is equally critical of Conservatives and Labour in its lyric. Another aspect of Revolver is what we might call the social commentary of the album, and this is featured in the second track. I'm referring to slide 19. Paul McCartney penned this song, although it was published as a Lennon-McCartney original. Eleanor Rigby is a poignant reminder of those left out and left behind by Britain's capitalist consumer society. McCartney had immersed himself in contemporary classical music, and the production of Eleanor Rigby reflects this, in that he gave up the usual guitar parts and drum parts and chose instead a classical instrumental backing under the direction of the Beatles' producer, George Martin, who himself was a classically trained musician. This single reached #1 in the charts. It's one of the most literary songs in the Beatles' canon. One contemporary novelist, A.S. Byatt, described the lyric as having the minimalist perfection of a Beckett short story. A third aspect that this album Revolver, produced in 1966, released in 1966, presents is that of experimentation, oral experimentation. And one of the most durable songs from the album that still sounds revolutionary today is Tomorrow Never Knows. This was a Lennon-penned song, although again it was published as a Lennon-McCartney original, inspired by Lennon's reading of Aldous Huxley, The Gates of Perception, and Timothy Leary, who was the guru of psychedelia and LSD. And Tomorrow Never Knows is based on tape loops with added Indian instrumentation. Tape loops are often involving the instruments being played back in reverse it's groundbreaking. It also announces the later experiments that, in fact, were a continuation of the same sessions of Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane that were recorded in December of that year, as the Revolver sessions continued into the Sgt. Pepper recording sessions. It was also challenging for the sound engineers at Abbey Road Studio, in that Lennon and the Beatles wanted to achieve a sound that could not be reproduced using existing studio equipment and techniques, and therefore they had to improvise and adapt the equipment and invent new techniques. For instance, Lennon wanted to achieve the effect of 1,000 Tibetan monks chanting, and that was eventually achieved by feeding Lennon's voice through the revolving speaker of a Hammond organ, and so it was only achieved through improvisation in the studio. Many of the technological advances made in the period and that would become standard in studio recording in later decades were actually the product of the interaction between the creative interaction between the group and the sound engineers at Abbey Road Studios for the recording of those post-tour albums. This brings us to the question of the end and of the Beatles' career, and it's represented here in an undated cartoon by Stanley Franklin, appeared in The Sun. It must be close to December the 31st, 1970, because that's when McCartney initiated the proceedings in the High Court to dissolve the Beatles partnership. The wreath, the funereal wreath, tells us that the end is nigh, but that the four musicians will leave their trace in popular culture. And so this cartoon anticipates the curation of their legacy as a lieu de mémoire, as a site of memory, in transnational culture, where the songs become so many monuments to that memory. So how could we conclude our survey of Beatlemania and the Beatles' career in the 1960s and its the way that intersects with social and political changes in the decade? The first thing I think we can say is that with following Fallowell in the Dictionary of Modern Culture, is that the Beatles records provided the soundtracks, that's to say the reference points on a global scale, for a decade of astonishing developments in new ideas. So it's the first point. The soundtracks to our lives really comes from the period of the 1960s and from the Beatles' careers. Secondly, that Beatlemania was a transnational mass phenomenon. If it subsided after 1966, when the group stopped touring, it was nevertheless prolonged through their studio experimentations, in which they explored new sounds and invented revolutionary new approaches to sound effects and to sound technology. Revolver in 1966 can be seen as a turning point because it pushed back the boundaries of what was possible then in popular music. It's a record that is once more literary in its lyrics, and here we feel the inspiration, we can see the inspiration of Bob Dylan, for instance, that poet-musician of the 1960s. And at the same time, it's a vehicle for social and political observation and for the expression of a countercultural consciousness. We should note that the Beatles were the object of political recuperation, or at least attempts at political recuperation, by both Labour and Conservative governments of the 1960s. But the Beatles found their own political voice in rejecting those overtures. We cited the case of the Song of Taxman, 1966, or in Lennon returning his MBE as an anti-war protest, as an anti-Vietnam War protest. After 1966, the Beatles achieved critical recognition as recording artists, and they began to shed their image of clean-cut youths, besuited youths, and to shed their intergenerational appeal and become more closely identified with the late 60s or mid to late 60s counterculture that was developing in the United Kingdom and the United States. Counterculture, of course, which was more oriented towards the left. The Beatles' career ended in 1970, and that in itself neatly folds with the end of the decade, and therefore that explains to some extent, as coincidence explains to some extent, why they've come to be so closely associated with the swinging 60s. We have argued that the Beatles remained, throughout their career, early, mid and late career, a barometer of change in British society. These upwardly mobile, working class northerners from Liverpool, from the provinces, who made it both in the national capital and then internationally on a global scale. And they made it creatively. They made it through their skill and their talent and their impudence, their ability to challenge norms and to find a new idiom for creative expression. If phony Beatlemania had bitten the dust by the end of the 60s, the critical consecration of the Beatles' music would continue and would be completed by the time of the issue of the retrospective anthology studio outtakes at the end of the century, 1995. And since then, the popular appeal of the Beatles as a group has been sustained by the periodic reissue and remasterization of their back catalogue. For instance, the White Album was remastered in 2018, and Abbey Road has just been remastered and re-released. And as you probably know, Let It Be, which was originally called Get Back and was indeed called Get Back in the United States, is about to be remastered, re-released, and made the object of a film by Peter Jackson, a documentary film to be released later, so next year now, in the summer of next year, to coincide with the release of the Get Back sessions, a film made by Peter Jackson, the director of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. The surviving members of the Beatles, because there are now only two, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, continue to curate the cultural memory of the group. And by way of a coda on the legacy of the Beatles, I've included a lyric from the Clash's most famous single, London Calling, which goes like this: London Calling, now don't look to us, phony Beatlemania has bitten the dust. And and it was supposed in the 1970s that the punk movement had effectively put an end to Beatlemania and to the, the the Beatles, the social and political complacency of the times. But as Mick Jones, the guitarist with the Clash, explained in interview in 2018, the line about phony Beatlemania was aimed at the rock bands of the late 1970s, which sounded like imitation bands, tribute bands to his ears. He points out that the Clash themselves were fans of the Beatles, the Who, and the Kings, but they didn't want to go back to remake that music, but they wanted to face up to new contemporary issues and to invent their own idiom. So things were going to pieces, there was an emergency, etc. So one of the things to emphasize is the continuity in the creative legacy that many of the punk and post-punk bands actually expressed admiration for the Beatles. The more regressive, perhaps, admiration later came about with Britpop in the 1990s. But a consensus has formed amongst musicians about what they owe to the innovations of the Beatles, and the Beatles taking popular music from the purely commercial forms of as they saw it, of the 1950s and early 1960s, and transforming it into an art form in its own right. So I shall conclude there by pointing you to a few readings. Perhaps the most important of all is Ian MacDonald's Revolution in the Head, which remains the definitive study of the Beatles' musical and creative legacy. First published in 1995, still available, and Cambridge University Press's The Complete Guide to the Beatles, published in 2009. They were the two I would point you to. Thank you, and I look forward to discussing these issues with you at a later date, and in tutorial through my colleagues.